Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Nick and Colin for inviting me. I'm so excited. I feel a little bit, I know I'm a little bit different here because I'm an activist and there's a lot of academics and media professionals here, but maybe my input will be interesting. So I am an activist. I work with an organization, as I said, called Ex-Muslims of North America. And I spend quite a bit of time talking about truth, more specifically about the necessity of being honest and of acknowledging inconvenient facts. And the question that I hope that we can discuss and think about today is civil liberties and their relationship with honest and clear dialogue. That is to say, to what extent is an exercise of power to restrict dialogue legitimate, and what effect can this have on the health of our civic society and our quest for truth? So again, I'm going to be speaking on the ways in which this reality affects me specifically. So we're going to be kind of going down my experiences, but I think that some of those experiences can highlight some of the more tricky issues when it comes to dialogue and honest dialogue. So I hail from America, which is certainly going through what is a post-truth presidency. And, like most people, I watched in abject horror when Kellyanne Conway described her version of the number of President Trump's audience as, an alternative fact as opposed to simply being a lie. Until that point, there wasn't really much of that. There was quite a bit of that presidency, which was disturbing in a variety of ways, made me angry in a lot of ways, made me grieve in a lot of ways. But there was something about the denial of a easily observable and verifiable fact that was horrifying and deeply unsettling. I remember that she didn't hesitate to do it, and I believe that she understood that in the end it really wouldn't matter. I admit, though, that I'm not surprised that this is what's become of our politics. There appears to me to be an observable sickness, not just in America, but one that is unique to all Western first world democracies, of which the current president is a symptom and a harbinger of worse to come. It is worth examining how we got here in the hopes of changing course. We're facing a legitimation crisis, not only in politics, but in nearly all social institutions. Trust in media to provide the truth, in academia to seek it, in subject matter experts to analyze it fairly and accurately, all seem to be slipping away. We live in a complicated world. We depend on our institutions to guide us. And if we cannot place our trust in them, we are left as citizens paralyzed, and as our democracies are crippled. The post-truth society is one in which there is an access to an unfathomably vast amount of knowledge right at our fingertips, and yet we have fewer filters, fewer trusted authorities, and this creates a sense of apathy in some of us, and in others, the desire for the simple clarity of dogma. There are many phenomena we can lay blame to. The internet and social media as the most obvious disruptive innovation, warping our sense of the world by providing us with a personalized news feed, allowing our social bubble to determine the facts that we are confronted with, and undermining traditional media. But in some sense, that loss of trust is earned by the institutions themselves. I know that my own trust in the media and even in academia has diminished since my involvement in activism. I was quite naive in the beginning, and I didn't quite realize that I was stepping onto a third rail when I discussed the role of Islam in society. I had not imagined that I would face any difficulties in convincing my fellow liberals and progressives that the religion of Islam contained within it elements that should be directly challenged, illiberal beliefs which were bound to create toxic social realities which should be acknowledged and addressed. I received some confusing messages from the political left in the past, what felt like naive romanticism in the approach to faith. I believed the solution was merely education, but I was wrong. Ignorance does play a small role, but it is quickly evident that instead I was facing an unwillingness to engage with reality as it is, not because it is difficult to believe or even to prove, but largely due to fears of the consequences of doing so. I began to realize that I could not rely on my side to address the issue honestly. It used to seem like conservative grumblings of a liberal bias and lean were just that. But it seems that sometimes there is some truth to it. And suddenly, now that I stand on the wrong side of things, even while reality and fact and fundamental progressive and liberal principles all seem to be with me, there's a denial. And the more I looked, the more I found that the distortion had its roots in a variety of philosophies and ways of thinking established long ago and now bearing fruit. I will talk about just one of them in this short amount of time. But at the very least, I will say that I am allowed to talk about it. I was raised Muslim, and I'm a visible minority, so that slows down some of the smears of bigotry, although it does not stop them. Meanwhile, those who agree with me and publicly declare it so, but happen not to share my background, or are white and male, or all three, God forbid, can face ruinous damage to their reputation. It is bizarre to witness this disparity in treatment for the expression of the same sentiment. I am acutely aware of the shift that this represents in my own responsibilities as an activist. I have always expected to give voice to some of the concerns of ex-Muslims like me, those who share my values, who went through similar experiences, who are not free to speak because they face greater dangers or imminent violence or live in Muslim-majority countries. But now it feels like that the group who can find a voice within me has expanded outside of ex-Muslims. And I've heard the sentiment explicitly stated by progressives and liberals and feminists. But why should it matter if a feeling comes from my lips? Why does that make a difference? Does truth not exist, or is it not worth discussing unless the right person is there to voice it? And therein, I believe, lies a logic that is bound to prove extremely corrosive. There's a tendency to treat identity as a source of unquestionable revelation. That is not to say that identity should be irrelevant. Certainly in the case of minorities of all stripes, racial, sexual, they have knowledge based in experience which is valuable and provides us with new information or a unique or forgotten or overlooked perspective. Certainly life experience and perspectives are worth serious and compassionate consideration, and yet identity has become something of an epistemic qualification. If you do not have the right identity of experience, you should not be allowed to speak, so say some of the most extreme social justice warriors. This tendency is often not voiced directly, but the logic is present everywhere. Even thought which is not explicitly not real, even to thought which is not explicitly not real. Writers of fictions can find themselves condemned by online mobs if they taught online as well. In a controversial speech last year, to give one example, the writer Lionel Shriver expressed her exasperation at the idea that culture can be appropriated. In the latest ethos, she said at one point, in the latest ethos, which has spun well beyond college campuses in short order, any tradition, any experience, any costume, any way of doing and saying things that is associated with a minority or disadvantaged group is ring-fenced. Look but don't touch. I would add that if you must touch, only a reverent acquiescence to an established authoritative voice will do. In response to her speech, the Muslim activist Yasmin Abdul Majid, I'm probably mispronouncing that, clarified what she believed to be the stakes, what she thought was the real motive behind the cries of literary and imaginative freedom. The attitude drips of racial supremacy, she said, in a Guardian piece published soon after. The implication is clear. I don't care what you deem as important or sacred. I want to do with it what I will. Your experience is simply a tool for me because you are less human than me. You are less than human. Clearly, identity is serious business, and as well it should be, as minority rights around the world rallied around shared identities, the struggle for equal rights and liberties, the desire to be granted the same dignities as anyone else, as a vital part of achieving a just world. But there's a distinction that we should make here. Politics around identities all make claims of difference between their group and the outside world. What makes the toxic breed of identity distinct is that difference is acknowledged. The difference acknowledged is not just one of unjust treatment or an unfair circumstance, That is to say, just a difference in the way things are or the way that they are treated, which can be communicated and understood by others. Instead, the claim is of an exclusive access to certain kinds of knowledge, bestowed directly by identity, and access which cannot be transferred. Due to this reasoning, the identity of a person making a claim becomes as important as the claim itself. Identity can grant you access to certain topics of discourse. It can also be a shield from criticism by those who do not share the same access. Holders of certain identities are by fiat holders of some truths related to those identities, and therefore criticizing an idea derived from such exclusive access leads to charges of criticizing the validity of the identity itself. As an illustration, consider the recent behavior of Muslim American activist Linda Sarsour. She was quite prominent. Recently, she was a part of the Women's March. Linda wears a hijab and acts as a representative to Muslim America. Earlier this year, Jake Tapper, an acclaimed and respected CNN anchor, criticized Sarsour and the choices of the organization she was affiliated with. Her instinctive response was to paint him as one who targets her because of her identity as a Muslim, calling Tapper, who is a tireless campaigner against the misbehavior of the Trump administration, alt-right. When Tapper referenced prior unsavory comments by her, she responded with, quote, "Please share my ugly sentiments. Unapologetically Muslim, unapologetically Palestinian, pro-immigrant, pro-justice." This was not the first time she used identity to deflect criticism. In an event earlier this year, an attendee asked her to explain some unsavory comments she made. This is a quote from what he said. "Hi, this question is really important because I believe women's rights are also human rights. So I really want to know under what circumstances it's acceptable to say, I wish I could take their vaginas away. They don't deserve to be women. Just to give that context, that's one of the tweets off of your Twitter." Sarsour's response, again, was to use identity as both a shield and a weapon. So let's give some context here, because we have, this is an event organized by an Asian American, right? Let's just get some context to what is going on here. Celebrating a community, right? Talking about communities of color who are being directly impacted by this moment. And I have a young white man in the back who is not directly impacted by any of the issues I mentioned. As identity becomes effective at halting dialogue and dodging criticism, it will inevitably be used for the same end by opportunists from the right as well as the political left. Some of you might know of Milo Yiannopoulos. He is an odious alt-right provocateur, and he acknowledges this reality repeatedly. Openly gay and married to a black man, he believes he can get away with saying certain things because he is gay and has relations with black men in a way that others cannot. Those who would otherwise be proponents for identity politics recognize this weakness. People from minority groups may also betray ideological diversity amongst themselves, which creates a dilemma. Which experience-based truth counts as the real truth? To alleviate some of these concerns, the question of authenticity of that identity becomes more important. And often is used to dismiss dissenting opinions from people within identity groups. Ex-Muslims like me are routinely dismissed as inauthentic. We are accused of never having been Muslims in the first place. We are accused of being paid actors. We are accused of lying for some fame or acceptance from the West, anything to cast doubt on our authenticity as former Muslims. When that identity is racial, there are efforts to draw boundaries and crystallize distinctions that once activists had worked to dismantle. When Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a fierce and controversial critic of Islam, herself a Somali woman and former Muslim, was invited to speak at Yale, a student group defending their choice claimed that she does not, quote, represent the totality of the ex-Muslim experience as a reason for her not speaking there, which begs the question, who does represent the totality of the ex-Muslim experience, and who are they to be chosen by? This simply illustrates that despite lip service to the preeminence of identity, even its proponents utilize it merely as a political tool. When faced with someone with the right identity credentials but the wrong ideas, they scramble to take those credentials away, revealing that even they don't believe that identity or experience necessarily confers unquestionable, unique wisdom or truth. Identity epistemics claim that they that they are legitimized by the authority of experience, but it is clear that instead it is an aspiration to power that is beyond question. To change tactics a little bit here, I want to make a distinction between authority and power. Authority is power that is granted. It is legitimized. It is justified. It requires some level of agreement and consent. Although occasionally they are one and the same, power does not require legitimization or consent. In the current legitimation crisis, where we face a lack of trusted authority, we face no lack of those happy to coerce, to form mobs, to smear, to blame. Although simple reality and facts have always had an uneasy relationship with power and politics, the reduction of reality to just being a simple utility, to be abandoned and ignored at will, is done without much apology or pretense or shame. Similarly, the restrictions of speech can also be considered exercises of power, which handicap dialogue necessary for the attainment of truth. Historically, restrictions of speech are used by those in power who have and want to hold on to that power. They don't want their version of truth to be open to discussion. That is why we have censorship to shut down opposing views that may threaten that truth all over the world, especially in authoritative countries. But saying the truth out loud is just as important as acknowledging it in your own head. Educated and engaged people have told me point blank that they cannot support my activism even though they know that what I say is true. Now is not the right time. In Muslim countries, they say that the criticism of Islam is hate speech. They can pass those laws because they have the power to do so, criminalizing certain kinds of thought, crippling the advance to truth. Restriction of speech and thought is always a power play, and one that affects our ability to discern truth in that it restricts dialogue. But some might find that to be a problematic statement. They might say that those who are harmed by hate speech have no power to throw around, which is why the speech restrictions must be there to protect them. But the black and white dichotomy of powerful and powerless is absurd at the face of it and unhelpful. Certainly, the group that finds itself the target of hate might have less power than other groups, but the ability to impose that restriction itself requires a degree of social and cultural power. A truly powerless agent cannot restrict anyone's speech, not by themselves, not through convincing others. Minorities and women are able to demand speech restrictions for hurtful and offensive speech today, after an improvement in our status. The same concerns which would have been ridiculed only a few decades ago. But so what if speech restrictions are a power play? So long as any disparity exists and the restriction may ease stresses and burdens of those who are less powerful, why does it matter? I believe that speech restrictions are unhelpful and destructive for many reasons. In the interest of time, I cannot go over most of them. But I will say that they do make a truth claim. That is that the institution or the individual who is imposing the restriction is able to judge accurately the direction and intensity of power relations. We imagine this kind of censorship protects the weak, but this assumes that we know who the weak are and are willing to acknowledge that they're suffering. It assumes a benevolent and omniscient authority. In addition, those in power often do not acknowledge the injustices faced by the weak when it is not in their benefit to do so. Ex-Muslims are an example of this. Those in power, similarly, are not omniscient and cannot be relied upon to harm others by their restrictions. Again, ex-Muslims can prove an example when our criticism of religion is painted as Islamophobia. It's difficult to tie a bow to all this, but I will just leave you with this. If there is to be an effective or a more just society, it requires that current conditions are challenged. At risk here is the health of our civic society, the ways in which we are limited in our ability to interact with the intellectual discourse honestly. So are we? Excuse me, sorry. So as long as we are ineffective in being able to interact with this intellectual discourse, so our politics become distorted. I've made my perspective evident, I think, through the examples, but I'd like to hear those of the panelists and the audience, specifically to address the question of when can power legitimately restrict dialogue and discourse, and when it is beneficial to do so. I have some other questions too, but I wanted to maybe get it started before adding them. Thank you.